Jim, thank you so much for that, as for so much help over so many things over so many years. Your kind words there are a cheering counterweight to something I read at the weekend while I was preparing quite a different lecture. I was reading William Warburton's comments on Pope's Dunciad, never the most cheering task. And there I read that the station of a professor is only a kind of legal notice to inform us where the shattered hulk of learning lies at anchor. So, having issued that health and safety warning, if I may be permitted a moment more solemn, in delivering this inaugural lecture, there are three people I'd like to call to mind that we don't see with us this evening. Reaching quite a long way back, I think of my parents, and thinking just back to last year when we lost Howard Erskine Hill, whom all of those of you who knew will know was just the best and most loyal of PhD supervisors that a person could have. So I wanted to bring those people to mind. But today, what I have promised to do is to talk about what the editor learns and why it might matter. Well, scholarly editing and the study of literature in its material forms has been a big thing at English in Birmingham since the beginning. So if we think of Edward Arber, who in the later 19th century at Mason College, our predecessor institution, shared his fascination with early books and literature with a wide range of readers through his pioneering English reprints series, using facsimile typography to give ordinary readers a taste of what Tudor books were like. Or if we think of Ernest de Selencourt, Professor of Literature here from 1908, who changed forever how we read Wordsworth. His 1926 edition of Wordsworth's Prelude first gave us that now familiar layout of an 1805 prelude in parallel with the later 1850 prelude, and thus he helped readers think about a great poem in a new way, with a consciousness of its textual forms and how they changed over time. And now we centre our ongoing commitment in the Centre for Literary Editing and the Materiality of the Text. And it would be foolhardy of me indeed to single out individual colleagues from amongst my current and recent colleagues in the University of Birmingham as editors, because even within the less than 20 years that I've been here, it would be just too long a list, let alone to list those who now have new editions in planning and in preparation. Yet, to people who've never done editing, and after all, that is most people, even most people who are academics in the field of literature, editing may seem perhaps mysterious, and perhaps mysterious in a not altogether interesting way. But for me, the processes of editing are where I get my ideas from, and tonight I'd like to share some of those experiences with you. The kinds of points I'm going to make could be made about many authors of many periods, but I'm going to make them about Jonathan Swift, and there he is, the famous author of Gulliver's Travels, the celebrated Irish patriot, and Dean of St Patrick's in Dublin. And to make it even narrower, I'm going to focus only on works of Swift that were included in that volume 2 of the Cambridge Swift that I've just edited. And that means that most of what I'm going to talk about is works of Swift that are not amongst the most familiar. But arguably, they have the particular interest of being a bit off the beaten track. So, here's the image from the publisher's webpage for volume 2 of that Cambridge edition of the works of Jonathan Swift. It's called Parodies, Hoaxes, Mock Treatises, Polite Conversation, Directions to Servants, and Other Works. Now, you might think that the point of editing is to finish the edition and get it published, all 911 pages and 1.42 kilograms of it, as the publisher helpfully informs us further down this page. And after the years it took, I would have a certain degree of sympathy with that approach. And the AHRC, to whom I'm indebted for funding it in part, are no doubt also pleased that I did actually finish it and get it published. But what I really want to focus on today is not so much how to make an edition as what you might learn from the process of making it, and how that might be then a way of moving on to something new. So I'm going to try and give you some kind of basic sense of what I do as an editor, give some instances of what I think I've learned, and then reflect on where that might lead us. So to start with, I think there are three crucial things that I do as an editor. First, I think an editor has to think about all the works of the author, not just the popular, famous, or attractive ones. And there is a lot to be learned from just that evenness of attention, the small as well as the large, the obscure as well as the famous. Second, I need to map each work in relation to previous writing, to see how it relates to what's already been written and what's traditional in it and what's new. And third, and this for me is at the very heart of the process, I have to identify the material texts, the books and manuscripts of each work, and compare them with each other. So to begin, let's start with that business of thinking about all the works. Most major multi-volume editions, like the Cambridge Swift, share out the volumes amongst different editors. And once you know which bundle of works has been assigned to you, you have to ask the same questions systematically about every work in your volume, no matter how silly, scrappy, or otherwise unattractive you may personally think some of them to be. So let's look at the contents. This is the contents of the main body of this volume. That's the title, and here we have the 21 items in the main body. Let's not get into the appendices. The ones I'm going to talk about today are lit up in red. It's a slightly scary array, at least to anybody who's got to edit them all. The volume titles already indicated what kinds of things they're supposed to be: parodies and send-ups, hoaxes and scams, bizarrely satirical pseudo-essays on supposedly important topics. And that title also singled out polite conversation and directions to servants, the last two on this slide, as the largest individual works. These are two pieces that Swift worked on over many decades, but were only sent to press at the very end of his life. What are they about? Well, polite conversation explains with copious worked examples in the form of dialogues amongst Lord and Lady Smart and their guests, how to keep talking when you have absolutely nothing to say. And the answer to this social emergency is memorize old proverbs and smart aleck repartee, and then learn which bits to repeat at each mealtime. Its supposed author, Simon Wagstaff, explains that learning and repeating such memorised material by rote is the absolute duty of all loyal citizens under George II and his minister Walpole, for it is indeed the only surefire way of making everybody too busy to get round to criticising the government. Indeed, Wagstaff confidently expects to get a grant for it and a vote of thanks in Parliament. Directions to Servants, on the other hand, explains to servants how to save time and effort as you go about your daily duties. The advice, needless to say, is calculated to reduce employers' homes and finances, not to mention their mental health, to chaos and disarray. But there are also smaller works in this volume, and they too are an important part of any editor's task. And particularly interesting are the papers in the Bickerstaff hoax, which are the first group in red in the first column. One specific kind of interest that these papers represent is that scholarship often mentions them in general, but nobody much discusses them in detail, and that's always a great opportunity. Now, Swift was a churchman, zealous for the interests of the established church, and this hoax attacks a popular astrologer who was a persistent thorn in the side of the High Church party. John Partridge was an extreme Whig and denigrator of the Anglican hierarchy, and he published an annual almanac, the kind of thing that people then would buy and use as a means of personal organisation, just as we might buy and use a pocket diary. Partridge's almanac was called Merlinus Liberatus, Merlin set free, and in it, if you liked that kind of thing, Partridge would every year pontificate glumly about the alleged threats to society from the High Church party, which he tended to assimilate to his general sense of a threat to British society from continental Catholicism. Now, this was offensive to churchmen like Swift on two counts. He and his High Church colleagues didn't accept that they were a threat, and they certainly didn't accept that they were Catholics. So, to respond to Partridge's sniping at the established church, Swift invents Isaac Bickerstaff, a fictitious author who issues predictions for the year 1708. And this interesting pamphlet prophesies that everybody you've ever heard of on the continent, and a few more, will die in 1708, starting with the King of France and the Pope and working gradually downwards. And Bickerstaff also adds, and entirely gratuitously, that Partridge himself will die on the 29th of March, which of course he didn't. From there, predictably, the hoax runs and runs, with Swift following up with more and more papers and other writers, often unidentifiable, piling in with more pamphlets, sometimes pretending to be Partridge or pretending to be other people involved. And the gallery of receding mirrors goes on and on. A very different kind of performance, however, as we come to the bottom of the first column, is Swift's proposal for correcting and improving and ascertaining the English tongue. Now, this is particularly interesting for this volume. It's a piece that presents entirely without irony. This is Swift's 1712 proposal to Queen Anne's Lord Treasurer, Robert Harley, Earl of Oxford, for a British academy to be in some ways like the French one, to refine and stabilise the language. It was, in its time, a very political proposal, and it was received as such by Swift's political opponents who wrote against it. Now, we usually read it today as a work of linguistic analysis, and let's face it, a fairly dismal one. But this, the political aspect, was something else that the work of editing was able to open up for me. And as well as the works I've mentioned, there are lots of little pieces in the volume, including some that have proved fairly unattractive to posterity and are seldom discussed at all ever by anybody. But the editor still needs to give them proper attention, and they may well, partly because they've received so little attention, have something new to reveal. It may come as a surprise, perhaps, that so famous an author as Swift has works in his canon that people don't talk about, but this is indeed the case. So, to move on to that second thing that I said I do as an editor, with all the separate works lined up in a nice list, the editor needs to find out how each of them relates to other writing, whether ancient or recent, that was available at the time. What else was in the air? Who else was working in similar forms and modes? What does each work in the volume share with previous writings, and what's new about it? For my volume, I needed to ask some particular questions. First, what else had been written on Swift's topics or in Swift's genres? And that would have to include both contemporary writing and much older books, going often back into the 16th century and sometimes much, much further than that. So, apart from what we might normally call literature, I read almanacs and books about astrology, about education, about devotional meditation. I read plays, books about politics, books about the English language, about Ireland, about puns, proverbs, about politeness, about domestic service, about how to do housework. In all, a fascinating range of kinds of material. You might call it a bizarre assortment of material. A list it's quite unlikely anyone would assemble for any other purpose than annotating these particular works by Swift. And from such an unusual selection of reading, it's always likely that you'll spark off some ideas, come up with some way of looking at things. And I have always found that I inevitably get a different sense of how a particular work intervenes in the discourses going on around it. Another question that needed to be asked. What other publications had used phrases and ideas like those used by Swift? And this was particularly at issue in polite conversation, where some people have thought that this stuff is so balmy, Swift must have invented it. But when these characters are exchanging a tissue of barnyard proverbs and stupid repartee, how much of this material actually had an existing life in print? Well, quite a lot, it turns out. Some of it turns up, say, in rogue biographies, low-life accounts about criminal behaviour. Some turns up in the mouths of low characters in late 17th century drama. Some turns up in a rather specialised genre, that of the 17th century Virgil travesty, where you retell the story of Virgil's Aeneid in the lowest possible language. It is an opportunity to use items in your vocabulary that might not otherwise get an airing. So the previous lives that these expressions have led, of course, does no credit at all to the pretended politeness of Swift's characters. And a final question. What are these parodies of? It was always clear that my volume was going to have parodies in its title. So what were these older books that Swift's parodies were supposed to be parodies of? And this turned out to be perhaps the single most surprising thing about editing this volume, because often I couldn't find any. And this makes me wonder if we've been, to an extent, deceived by Swift into believing that the bookshops were already stuffed with the kind of books that he seems to decry. I now think it's probably rather different. In works like Polite Conversation and Directions to Servants, I think Swift is rather picking up scattered hints from books that already exist, and then working them up into those extraordinary nightmare scenarios that he insists are their logical conclusion. It may not be what you want, but it's what you'll get, he seems to say. These sorts of works then might be something more like pre-parodies. They arguably precede the books that they at first sight seem to parody. So it wasn't until the early 19th century, for instance, that I found a book that really seemed to parallel Directions to Servants. Parallel it in the sense that it's a book that gives detailed instructions by an experienced servant for performing the roles of all servants, both male and female, in a major household. And when that book does appear in 1825, The Complete Servant by Samuel and Sarah Adams, it actually mentions Swift's directions. Swift seems sometimes almost to have the ability to make time run backwards. So now then, I come to the third of the three things I do as editor, and for me, as I said before, it's the very core, the indispensable heart of the editing process, that is, comparing the material text of the work. So by material text, I mean an object that is a text of the work in question. And for Swift, that's often a manuscript. More often, it's a printed leaflet, a pamphlet, or a book. It can, of course, be a slab in a church wall. It can be most sorts of things. But for each work, the editor needs to compare these material texts, I think, in two ways. The first is to say, what kind of material object is it? So, for example, if it's printed, how does it use type design, paper quality, to indicate its place in the contemporary market for print products and reading matter? How dear or cheap would it be to buy? How does it fit the profile and business plan of the printer or bookseller who produced it? And how do all those things bear, perhaps, on the meanings that it might have had for contemporaries? And the second way of comparing the material texts is perhaps more obvious, asking the question, exactly what words, in what order, does this particular text of the work contain? How does this sequence of words differ from those presented in the other material texts of the same work? If there are differences, can we see a pattern? Indeed, are the differences in words or sequences part of a larger set of changes over time, perhaps? Or part of some other bigger picture? So, having just briefly surveyed these three big things that I do as an editor, I want now to give some instances of what I think you might discover from studying and comparing the material texts of some particular works. And I begin with the earliest hoax, Bickerstaff papers from 1708 when Swift is in London. And here you see the title. These pamphlets are impersonating cheap popular print, the kind of thing you might buy from a hawker in the street. And they're purposely made hard to trace back to Swift. He covers his tracks. So the author, Isaac Bickerstaff, is a fiction. But how would you know that? There are people whose name is Bickerstaff. And the bookseller, named in the imprint, John Morphew, although he's a real person, is not the real originator of the publication. We know that Morphew is what's called a trade publisher. That is somebody who would give his name when, for whatever reason, the real originators, the real agents behind it, didn't want to. More interesting still, the name in being John Morphew is not Benjamin Tuck, who was Swift's usual publisher, but his name might have raised suspicions about Swift's involvement. So that's how it first appears. Like most of the Bickerstaff papers, this one then is pirated by other booksellers who fancy a slice of the action. And here's just one example. This is T. Wise having a go at it. Often these are even poorer in quality, and here you might think there's so much on the title page, do you need to open the book? And some of them are much more chaotic than this. Another of these papers, called The Accomplishment of the First of Mr. Bickerstaff's Predictions, actually purports to describe Partridge's death. Swift makes a supposed eyewitness, he says he's a civil servant, but he doesn't give his name, makes this eyewitness go round to Partridge's house and sit there till he dies, except it gets a bit smelly, so that he goes out to a coffee house and comes back at the vital moment. Now, Swift makes this supposed eyewitness use derogatory terms about Partridge's religion, and particularly his alleged nonconformity. And Swift says that makes this character say that on Partridge's deathbed he declared himself a nonconformist and chose a fanatic preacher as his spiritual guide. But in Armagh Public Library there is a single copy of a variant which has a London imprint but no publisher's name, some very sloppy print work. There are some very funny things with hyphens and italics going on if you read through this. And in this variant copy, the language is softened, and Partridge declares himself to be a true believer and has a zealous preacher to be his spiritual guide. I think, although this Armagh copy claims it was printed in London, that this is actually a Dublin printer sailing close to the wind and toning things down a bit in the hope of staying just on the safe side. And I have a Dublin printer in mind, Cornelius Carter, well known for sloppy print work. There would be a good reason, though, for Carter to be toning down Swift's language, because he was continually in trouble with the Dublin Whig and dissenting interest for publishing high church and sometimes Catholic materials. Be that as it may, a variant copy like this can lead us to thinking about how exactly a London hoax like this might have played with a Dublin as opposed to just a London readership. And then the last of the Bickerstaff papers claims to be an ancient prediction by Merlin. Swift obviously has just made it up himself. And it's got a very odd picture of Merlin, hasn't it? Now, in the process of going through a microfilm that I had to whiz through to compare other astrological publications, I realised that this woodblock wasn't made for this publication. It was an old one. It was one that Partridge himself was using to attack a high church astrologer called John Gadbury in the wake of the Glorious Revolution of 1688, so 20 years earlier. And here's just one of the publications in which John Gadbury was doing that. He had several outings. This is just a representative one. Merlinus Verax, the title at the top, Merlin the Truthful. It's a title that Gadbury has used in his own publications, and now Partridge is hammering him with it. And we have, because John Partridge claims that he did predict the revolution of 1688, and John Gadbury got it wrong because of his corrupt political and religious principles. And this book, as you can see, is Systematic Character Assassination. Nebula Anglicana, Storm Clouds over England, or the first part of the Black Life of John Gadbury. It's the same John Gadbury that was in the Popish plot to murder Charles II in the year 1678. It's the same John Gadbury that was accused of being in another plot, and so it goes on. This caricature is clearly being used for hostile purposes. But then in 1709, Swift is using it. It would surely have recalled to anybody with a long political memory Partridge's previous campaigns against astrological rivals and political opponents, perhaps making the point that Partridge was finally getting a taste of his own medicine? I don't know, but there is something going on here. So even if it's difficult to decode, there's a lot of significance in the precise material forms of the Bickerstaff papers as they're first published. So what happens when they are published in Swift's authorised collections of his own work, a process that starts as early as 1711? And what happens is that they lose a lot of the material thinginess that made this such a successful hoax. The cheapness of production values, the crude wood block of Merlin, all gone. And at the moment of incorporation into the authorised collections, the hoax starts to recede into that relative blandness of a uniformly produced canon. As a result, it loses that sharp relation to the personalities and issues it had originally engaged, because so much of the material signage is being stripped away. So in my edition, restoring some of that material sharpness was something I was keen to do. Whereas traditional accounts of the Bickerstaff papers have very often treated them as very general Enlightenment-style satire on astrology, I've preferred to focus more on the specific methods in 1708 of attacking a victim whose almanacs were giving a very specific political, religious and cultural offence to the High Church party. This question of incorporating individual works into collected works turns out always to be a fraught one for Swift. He's always loath to admit that the collections coming out have got anything to do with him, yet he ends up resentful when he lets other people do it, and then he disapproves of how they've done it. And this was the case in the 1720s with a set of joint miscellanies on which he collaborated with his friend Alexander Pope, but finally left Pope to organise. In the end, Swift felt that Pope had held back the best of his own work and stuffed the volumes with Swift's work instead. And I found, examining Swift's own copy of these miscellanies, which is in the Wren Library at Trinity College in Cambridge, that Swift had recorded his grumbles in a laconic note in an end paper, 252 pages of one author, he writes, that author being himself. Swift's longer-term response, however, in the early 1730s was peculiar and characteristically oblique. There was a Dublin publisher called Samuel Fairbrother, whom Swift didn't even like, and Fairbrother had taken to putting out unauthorised reprints of these miscellanies. Swift, as John Owen Fisher has shown, seems to have started slipping him or allowing other people to slip him up to the minute authorial corrections, as if surreptitiously controlling the transmission of his own work, of his own revisions. This, I think, is a seriously strange situation. But by the mid-1730s, Swift had decided to entrust his collected works to the Dublin publisher George Faulkner. And this is how this first presented. Coming out in 1735, and you can see this is offering you a multi-volume set, a volume of general prose, the poems, Gulliver, and writing about Ireland. And this was continued, added to later, and continued over after Swift's death. But you won't be surprised, I think, that Swift's support and authorisation, even for this, remained characteristically ambiguous and evasive. Now, I've said already how relatively bland the Bickerstaff papers look when they go into the authorised collections, and a similar point can be made about Faulkner's edition. For Faulkner, whose edition starts coming out in 1735 and goes on way beyond Swift's death in 1745, Faulkner increasingly reflects Swift's growing self-consciousness about linguistic correctness. One example, and I pray your patience here, is about verb forms, the third person indicative, in fact. Swift believed that the older third person in th was more correct than what he thought was the modern abbreviation in s. So Swift is advocating he doth, she saith, and not he does, she says. So that's one thing that tends to creep into Faulkner's edition over time. Punctuation gets heavier, it gets less rhetorical and more grammatical. And short forms get filled out. So though becomes although, till becomes until, tis becomes it is. Okay, if you like that sort of thing. But some of the speakers in Swift's works are notoriously of questionable education and taste, or indeed downright disreputable. So this creeping formalisation of language can give an oddly prissy gloss to the self-expression of those sorts of speakers. And that's another aspect, one that becomes very obvious in the editing process, of how Swift's works can lose vividness in the process of canonisation. One of the odd things about Swift, particularly odd I think from our point of view, for whom he is a famous author, one of the very odd things about Swift is that he very seldom puts his name to his publications, and when he does, it really says something. We see him shaping a material text to advertise himself as the author of a published work, and never more so than in 1712 in a proposal for correcting, improving and ascertaining the English tongue in a letter to the Most Honourable Robert, Earl of Oxford and Mortimer, Lord High Treasurer of Great Britain. And we see now the imprint names Benjamin Tooke, his real usual publisher. The tracing of this to Swift could hardly be plainer, as we'll see when we look into the book. This is an elaborate production. It couldn't contrast more with that flimsy Bickerstaff range of papers. And look how it ends. My lord, your lordship's most obedient, most obliged and most humble servant, J. Swift. Such a twiddly little bow that I can't read it without curtsying. But this is really using print to perform the rituals of obeisance, to perform the intimacy of the familiar letter. This proposal is highlighting Swift's deference to one of the highest in the land, Swift's name, Swift's claims for public notice, even the date and place of writing this, as he got increasingly more and more anxious as to whether Harley was going to do anything about this. Now, although we usually read this proposal today as a rather bad account of the English language, when we attend to its original presentation, it's clear that its main function for Swift is to perform, publicly and unmissably, his intimacy with Queen Anne's Lord Treasurer Robert Harley, who's recently been ennobled, and the new title is on the title page. Swift's aims are two: to secure from Oxford the establishment of a British Academy, which didn't happen, and to recommend himself as a candidate to be Historiographer Royal, which also didn't happen. So in annotating, I've highlighted and contextualised the sheer ambition of this print performance, as well as, and you have to do this, attending in detail to the highly questionable, even embarrassing linguistic analysis with which Swift attempts to woo Oxford's patronage. But the material texts can also tell us something about this. So, for example, when we compare an extant scribal manuscript of this work with the printed text, we can see how quite late on Swift has added a substantial compliment to Lord Oxford's learning and discernment by reporting at some length his views on Anglo-French relations in the Middle Ages. So that we can see the work being adjusted to to pay tribute to the reputation of Lord Oxford as a scholar. In this case, then, examining the material texts highlights the function of the published texts as an elaborate performance, a kind of courtship dance of deference and aspiration from Swift, the would-be historian of Queen Anne and Lord Treasurer Oxford. And I think, for me, seen from this materially inflected point of view, a proposal for correcting seems to make a lot more sense than the analysis of the English language that it contains. Yet there's another irony here. One of Swift's campaigns in the proposal is against the then standard present representation of some past tenses in ED with an apostrophe. You don't have to visualise it. Here it is, in the middle, in italics. he's given us some examples of what is, in his view, a deplorable usage. So, drudged, disturbed, rebuked, fledged, he says, are examples which he claims are unpronounceable. I don't think any of you have any problems with this. But anyway, Swift feels that they're unpronounceable. So if you're writing a book to claim that we ought to stop doing this and put the E back and get rid of that apostrophe, wouldn't it be nice if in your book you could get rid of the apostrophes? Not a hope. Even in this very book, some get through. This is the first edition, so obviously with the second edition you're going to have a really good go at that proofreading, aren't you? And this time only one gets through. I've lit it up in green for you. This return of the repressed apostrophe may seem a tiny detail, but I think it's an eloquent one. Swift's obsessions come right up against the boundaries of print feasibility, indeed perhaps of Swift's own abilities as a proofreader. And then there's a further kind of complication of Swift's agency in publishing his works, which we see with Polite Conversation towards the end of his life. This presents the odd example of having two 1738 first editions, one in London and one in Dublin, but they are very different material texts. Dublin, on the right-hand side, is produced in the standard format of Faulkner's works, by Faulkner. So that was set up and was just ready to go into a set of the works. But London, on the left-hand side, has a much more luxurious design. There is a lot more white space, less text on the page, hence it makes a thicker and a dearer book. If you go into it further, you will see that some paragraphs have been further split up, rather spoiling the flow of the argument, to make more white space. There's also some fairly flashy typography, which doesn't quite appear here. But how did this come about, that the London ends up being so much more luxurious a book than the Dublin one? Well, Swift had given his protégée Mary Barber, who was a poet whom he consistently supported, he'd given her permission to publish a London edition for her own benefit. So she was given a manuscript which she had in London, and she supervised a London production process effectively independent of what was going on in Dublin at the same time, and seems to have been pitching a luxury volume at a polite and possibly a profitable audience. Yet, how evasively, amidst all this, Swift would write to his Dublin publisher Faulkner about the supposedly deplorable fact that the London edition of Polite Conversation, which we know he himself had relinquished to Barber, was in danger of arriving in Dublin first and pipping Faulkner's own edition at the post. Swift writes, "Some of my friends wonder very much at your delaying to publish that treatise of polite conversation. I find people think you are too negligent, and if you delay longer, what you fear may come to pass, that the English edition may come over before you have your own ready." Who are these friends, these people? It is, as so often, as if Swift himself has nothing to do with any of this. Then we come to Directions to Servants, the last work sent to press in Pope's lifetime. And this, in contrast, shows us Swift ceding control of a work more completely still, this time to the frailty and memory loss of his final years. And here, the material forms are unusually eloquent. For, as well as the published first edition, there are two extant manuscripts, one in Swift's hand throughout, one scribal with Swift's handwritten corrections. Both of them are differently incomplete, and both give sad testimony of Swift's inability to get this work into any kind of coherent shape. So Faulkner's first edition appears just after Swift's death in 1745. This work, as published, certainly contains many, many fine sequences. So, for example, here's some advice on how to excuse yourself for being absent when wanted in the house. It often happens that servants sent on messages are apt to stay out somewhat longer than the message requires, perhaps 2, 4, 6 or 8 hours or some such trifle, for the temptation to be sure was great and flesh and blood cannot always resist. When you return, the master storms, the lady scolds, stripping, cudgelling, and turning off is the word. But here you ought to be provided with a set of excuses, enough to serve on all occasions. For instance, your uncle came 80 miles to town this morning on purpose to see you, and goes back by break of day tomorrow. A brother servant that borrowed money of you when he was out of place was running away to Ireland. You were taking leave of an old fellow servant who was shipping for Barbados. Your father sent a cow for you to sell, and you couldn't find a chapman till 9 at night. You were taking leave of a dear cousin who is to be hanged next Saturday. You wrenched your foot against a stone and were forced to stay 3 hours in a shop before you could stir a step. Some nastiness was thrown on you out of a garret window, and you were ashamed to come home before you were cleaned and the smell went off. You were pressed for the sea service and carried before a justice of the peace, who kept you 3 hours before he examined you, and you got off with much ado. A bailiff, by mistake, seized you for a debtor and kept you the whole evening in a sponging house. You were told your master had gone into a tavern and come to some mischance, and you inquired for his honour in 100 taverns between Pall Mall and Temple Bar. The excuses here are so varied, circumstantial, and, most importantly, uncheckable, that even to read them is to feel already battered into submission. Better just let it go, the master, the mistress thinks, rather than undertake the infinite regress of futile enquiry conjured by the offender's ingenuity. But the work as published is not all like this. It has long sequences of one-sentence paragraphs, and we all know what a fault in style that would be. It has headings for chapters that are represented only by the merest scraps and notes for what they might have contained. And there is, moreover, a pervasive failure of overall structure and direction. A poignant image of what Faulkner was up against survives in a little passage for the cook that he puts at the end. This was apparently found left over after the typesetting was finished, suggesting various ways here the cook can wreck the batterie de cuisine, to the taste of the food and the discipline of the staff. It's all good advice, but Faulkner couldn't see what to do with it. He puts it, he says, the following paragraphs belong to the cook but were left out by mistake. In later editions, he tries to find a place to put it in, but there isn't really a good place to put it in. The work isn't at that level of coherence. Paragraphs often exist in variants with different kinds of topic sentences. They don't go into a single unified sequence, whatever you do with them. Later, much later, in the early 1800s, when Sir Walter Scott was making an edition of Swift, Swift's great-nephew digs into his archive and comes up with yet more scraps from manuscript, including a new bit of the ex-footman narrator's backstory. I left my master, who had got the housemaid with child, and he gave me a portion to marry her, and got me an office in the customs. So it was in the footnotes of Scott's edition that readers first encountered this poignant hint on how to get on in the world. Faulkner had, in fact, done very well by Swift indeed, just turning directions into a book you could publish at all. And at this point, not surprisingly, Faulkner himself steps forward and speaks about directions, now signing his own initials at the beginning of the book. And he makes some interesting statements here. He assures the reader that the work's original may be seen in the printer's custody. So that's the bit you can't read in the middle of the first page. Because how else would people believe that this really was a new work by Swift, given that Swift had lost his memory and finally his language sometime previously, and that this was not unknown to the public? It's actually very unusual for the manuscript for Swift work to survive after publication, but for directions even today, there are parts of two, and that might be why. Faulkner also stresses something else that's interesting towards the foot of his first page. He says that although directions is only a rough draft with several outlines only drawn, it is at least all in the author's own words. It has no daubing or patchwork by other hands. The temptation might have been to get some kind of staff writer to turn these fragments into something coherent. We have to be grateful to Faulkner that he didn't do that and tried to print what he'd got. But it's in this, I think this is a very poignant moment in the formation of the Swift canon. It's in this moment of Faulkner's taking the stage to introduce directions that Swift the man passes from the scene, his authority safely bequeathed in his own handwriting, and Faulkner slides his works smoothly into that gap. And as we turn to consider how the Swift canon was further consolidated after his death, we're reminded of the many, many pieces that Swift wrote in his lifetime that for whatever reason he never published, and nobody else did either. These pieces start to crawl out of the woodwork in considerable numbers after his death. And pieces like this raise very interesting questions about what was at stake, both for Swift in not publishing them, and later for the inheritors or purchasers who did publish them. One theme that emerges particularly from the analysis of Swift's material texts, then, is that of his attitude to what we call authorship. Because for us being an author is a recognised profession, we may perhaps too readily approach Swift as being an author in some comparable sense. And examining the material text of his works is, I think, useful because it restores something of the immediacy of how his writing actually functioned as part of his larger professional and ideological commitments, whether as a friend and supporter to needy protégés like Mary Barber, or as a churchman defending the established church against the anti-clerical sniping of a John Partridge, or, more generally, in works like Polite Conversation and many more, satirising a government under George II and Walpole, that Swift accused of a specious and self-interested newfangledness, a distinctively Whiggish, modern, meddling arrogance that in his satirical projections threatened the basic order and decency of human life. In short, refocused by attending to the material forms of Swift's works, we can see Swift, I think, as a very specifically late early modern kind of writer. Less an author by profession than a professional for whom writing is part of the role. And very frequently, we see him moving towards, if towards is the word there, moving towards publication in a way that is characteristically, almost bizarrely, reserved and evasive. Not only does he often voice his works through a mask, a bickerstaff, a wagstaff, an ex-footman who never tells us his name, but he also withholds his own name from nearly all of his publications, and often involves his printers and booksellers in diversionary tactics that break any direct link leading back to Swift himself. Moreover, there seems to be with Swift a pervasive insertion into publication processes of what I find myself wanting to call the Indeterminacy Chip, some stratagem or ducking out of agency that Swift arbitrarily introduces into the publication process. It might be by giving away the publication rights as an act of charity. It might be by delegating oversight of the publication to an agent on the other side of the Irish Sea. It might be by withholding from his agents any but the most grudging and ambivalent authorization. And any of these stratagems could mean that the outcome of the process, the material text as published, slips out of his control and could later resurface as cause of grievance. But somehow in these cases, it's never Swift's fault. And death itself is perhaps the ultimate indeterminacy chip, as first signalled by Faulkner's foregrounding of his own protecting role in publishing directions to servants. So, after Swift's death, different inheritors of his manuscript material gradually bring their wares to market, adding to the Swift canon works that neither he nor anyone else had seen fit, for whatever reason, to publish in his lifetime, and publishing them, moreover, in material forms that clearly post-date Swift's lifetime. They wear an entirely different dress from anything we could have envisaged for them had they been published during his lifetime, and they emerge at chronological points when whatever issues they might originally have engaged are probably no longer on the table. So, having sampled some of the perspectives that an editor might gain from the work of editing, I return to that very important "so what" question. Why might it matter? Where might it take us? What an editor learns as I've been sampling it might feel small-scale, gritty, even slightly repellent, a kind of fine-grained residue that remains stubbornly under the fingernails when the work of editing is done. But, I want to argue, it's precisely this gritty persistence that gives us sharpness and traction to establish a new grip on the smooth opacity of an established reputation like Swift's. From such a refreshed point of contact, we can see Swift working across and between genres, between England and Ireland, across commitments to church, politics and literature, writing miscellaneously and as time and circumstances suggest. He then circulates his creations, or not, in some cases holding back his work for most or all of a lifetime. And when he does publish, his habitual concealment of his identity is only part of a complex and characteristic evasiveness about authorial agency. When we look online and in our libraries and bookshops at the major books that document and interpret the whole span of a given author's career, we already have good and fruitful models. There's the literary biography in all its varieties, interpreting the works as part of a life. Or there's the critical monograph that analyses a theme or technique or context of the works over the span of a writer's career. But what about a reading of Swift that puts editorial perspectives at its heart, that gives a new textually oriented whole career focus on the canon of this late early modern author? What about, for instance, a chronological focus on the moment of publication of each work, interpreting the decision to publish or not at a particular time and place with a particular printer or bookseller and in a particular design and format as a key to how a given work intervenes or not in its cultural and political moment? Such a focus would be particularly apt for a writer of the late 17th and early 18th century like Swift, for whom writing was less a profession in itself than part of a very particular late early modern orientation towards public responsibility. Swift's core professional identity was, after all, that of a high church clergyman in the Church of Ireland. And this makes him a revealing counterexample to the pioneering strategies of specifically authorial professionalism that are famously being engineered by his younger friend Alexander Pope in London at the same time. To think in this textually and materially grounded way about Swift's career would also give us a new perspective on what is, after all, the main reason we're still interested in Swift at all after all this time, the process by which Swift the man became Swift the works. Ranging across the two nations of Ireland and England, such a study could light up both national cultures of printing and bookselling, as Swift experienced and exploited them, which he did as client, as mischief maker, as victim of piracy, and ultimately as canonical property. It could help us understand in a new way the geological depositing over time of the layer upon layer of publications that gradually brought each one of his works to particular publics in his lifetime and transmitted them to particular posterities after his death. Analysing the formation of the Swift canon in chronological layers like this could also give us a new view of the other agencies, the other people involved. For to a remarkable extent, the presentation of Swift's works to their publics was shaped by people who were not Swift, whether they were print professionals acting for him, or catchpenny operators pirating his work without authority, whether they were exploiting their property in a work given as a gift, or in one purchased or inherited, with all the different orientations towards text and meaning that such complex mixtures of agency and motivation imply. But to tackle all those questions and investigate all the further questions that would emerge in the process, that would be a book in itself. So, just to be going on with, let's call it Publishing Swift, A Textual Life. Thank you.